Hello, and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with Jeffrey Poole and Joe Lalo. It's election night in the United States, so we're just ignoring it all and doing a podcast. And we were fortunate enough to get a guest who was willing to come on and talk writing and publishing with us, Scott King. I will read your intro here, Scott, and then let you talk a bit. Scott received his undergraduate degree in film from Towson University and his MFA in film from American University. He's written middle grade epic fantasy as well as publishing a number of other works we're going to ask him about. Until moving to Texas to follow his wife's career, Scott worked as a college professor teaching photography, digital arts. I need someone here to teach me speech, guys, and writing related classes. He now works full-time as a photographer and an author. In the blurb for the 5-day novel, which we're going to be talking about tonight, he says, after taking way too long to write a fantasy epic, author and educator Scott King refined his writing process so he could crank out a novel in 5 days. It seemed like a good subject for NaNoWriMo, and like I said, he was willing to come on tonight, so bonus points right there. Hi, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Sorry for mangling your introduction. I was impressed that you were a professor. I didn't know you were such a highfalutin intellectual type there.
I like teaching, and I definitely miss being in front of the classroom.
Awesome. Well, why don't you tell us what led you from film to writing and self-publishing?
Growing up, my dad was pretty sick, so I kind of stayed close to home for undergrad, even though I really wanted to go out to LA and do the whole screenwriting thing. When it came time for grad school, my dad got even worse. And again, I had to make the choice. I was like, well, do I go out there or do I stay here? And I decided I was going to stay on the East Coast. And it was kind of a situation where if I had gone, I probably would have regretted going anyway. So once I was here and realized, I was like, well, I'm getting a little old. The screenwriting thing's going to be harder to do now. I'm kind of like a full adult. I can't just do like a temp job or whatever. What else am I going to do? And that's when I kind of got into doing the graphic novels, which then led into the novels.
Nice. And I know I've kind of talked to you before, and I know you've been a long-time listener for the show. I think you've been waiting for us to get somebody on who's just killing it with middle grade fantasy or science fiction or anything fiction for middle grade. What are your thoughts on just like how that journey's been and like the market's looking like for middle grade fiction right now?
Well, I wrapped my middle grade series, and I'm currently publishing nonfiction, a political thriller, and then an adult epic fantasy. So you can see where I'm kind of shifting away just because it's hard. It's really, really hard. Scholastic owns the market, and unless you're in the schools doing the speaking and that kind of stuff, it's nearly impossible to sell it. And you can sell it, but it's a big commitment to make those kind of appearances.
Yeah, little known fact for listeners, my first thing I published was short stories for middle grade audience, a group of short stories, and I still love those characters, and I would love to write a series one day. That was kind of the plan, but I saw right away that the adult stuff had more potential. Do you have any advice for anybody else trying it, or do you just say give up on ebooks and self-publishing that and write thrillers?
I mean, I definitely loved writing middle grades, but it just, when the books take so long to even make back their money and only making it back because of the print sales or the ebook sales, it just wasn't financially viable to keep on doing it. Plus, you kind of want people to read your books. And I would constantly, at conventions for like board games and things like that, I'd have parents buy my books and they say, like, oh, my kids love it, blah, blah, blah. But it would be very minimal compared to the number of people who've bought my books like in the past 2 weeks, which is the thriller and the new nonfiction, where I have adults tweeting me and, you get the Facebook messages or you get the emails. And it's just because at this point, your audience is old enough to actually reach out and contact you. With middle grade, they can't.
Yeah, and do you feel that that age group is not really using the e-readers too much, or is it just a problem that you have to sell to the parents to get the kids to read it?
I definitely think if you're selling the ebooks, you have to sell to the parents. I know, at least for my books personally, I make more from the print sales than I do from the ebook sales. But I don't do anything to push them. I have like regular Amazon ads or Facebook ads, but they all point toward the the ebook copies.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to compete when I assume you're doing Create Space or somewhere like that, and it's hard to get the price down there with the mass market stuff.
Yeah. And I think even with the print ebooks, I priced them, I think it was like $9.99, so I'm making like $1.50 for each sale.
So what are your thoughts so far? I saw you just published your thriller, Ameriguns, was it just like a week or so ago? What are your thoughts on the new genre?
Well, I read a lot of middle grade. I read a lot of fantasy, and then I read a lot of thrillers. So it was something I felt comfortable writing with anyway. In terms of how it's going to do or what it's like breaking into the genre, I mean, we're a week out from when it published, so I'm still kind of feeling out where the book's going to land in terms of ranking. I definitely enjoyed writing it, and this is the book that I wrote in 5 days this past summer. And the idea just kind of like, hey, I just finished this epic fantasy. I'm not going to publish until I finish at least 2 more. I kind of want to just poop out some like quick books that are fun, that I at least have something that's just out there in the algorithms. And I was like, I know, I'm going to write a fantasy, and I'm going to write a thriller, and it's going to be fast. And you know what? I'm going to try to do it in 1 day, at least for first draft. So that was my real goals. I was trying to write 50,000 words in 1 day. And you and a lot of other people advised me not to do it. You said it was crazy. And you ended up being right, because I definitely could not have written 50,000 in 1 day. It took me 2 days to get through the first draft. And then, I did revisions, and I did a full rewrite pass, and then, polish.
So it took you 2 days to write 50,000 words. That sucks. You're pretty much a loser.
Well, it wasn't a full 50,000. It was like 38,000 because I underwrite, and then it got fleshed out as I went back and did rewrites.
All right, cool. What motivated you to do it in that short a time? Were you like, it was like a week off of work kind of thing, or you just were really eager to get something new done?
I just wrapped a Kickstarter project for a board game calendar, which is something I do every year. And then my wife's family was coming to visit, and we had a 2-week time span where I was like, well, I don't want to start a book, kind of get into it, and then we're on vacation traveling for 2 weeks, and I don't have time to work on it. I was like, well, I'm just going to do something stupid. I'm going to write a book 1 week, and then a book about writing the book the week after. And that's kind of how it just fell in place.
All right, cool. Well, we're going to ask you some more questions about the book specifically and what you learned for it and can teach people, but I'll pass you to the guys for some more intro questions. I should say really quickly that anybody out there should follow you on Facebook, because Scott is photograph D&D games and board games and things like that? That's the day job. It's really cool. He's always got these cool pictures of the games that, of course, they look nicely nerdy and geeky, like all of our peeps should like.
Yeah, so my time is kind of spent half between doing photography and then the writing thing. And for photography, I'm a product photographer for board game companies. So board game companies send me the board games, I take the photos, and then they go on like Amazon, they're printed for banners, they're used for sell sheets to sell them to other countries and that kind of stuff. So yeah, my feeds are always just filled with lots of weird games.
Sounds like the ideal job for one with geeky interests. All right, let me pass you to the guys.
Okay, well, first off, my friend Sean would flip out if he found out that you periodically get early access or free access to board games, because he is obsessed with them. So congratulations on having a dream job that he didn't know existed. Okay, so you've done both fiction and nonfiction now. How would you compare the process of writing each?
I actually put out my first book that I put out. It was a self-published, was Finish the Script, and it was based on my screenwriting course. So I kind of condensed all my notes and kind of shuffled them all in and structured out the class, but in a book form. And it's done really well, and it's been my bestseller. And from there is when I jumped into the fiction writing. And it's kind of weird because, at least for the nonfiction books, they're very much my voice. Whereas the fiction, it's much more, who's the POV character? It's kind of written in their voice. I mean, obviously, I'm still part of the story. It's the pacing and structures. It's still written because it's me and I put myself into it. But in terms of the actual narrative prose, the nonfictions, it's much more relaxing, much more calm. I get to be a little more chill. It's just fun.
It's interesting that I'd never really thought of that, but really the author of nonfiction is the only character in the nonfiction. I'd never even really thought about that, but there is still obviously some level of personality and stuff that goes into it. You don't want to write robotically. So I've never done any nonfiction, besides blog posts. So it's sort of interesting to me. Like, I've never had to put myself in that mindset. I am far more comfortable pretending to be a host of other people, apparently. All right, so our Twitter interaction suggests I already know the answer to this question, but I'll throw the bait out there for you. What do you think of the practice of writing to market?
I am not a fan of writing to market. It's not for me at all. But I say this in the 5-day novel. is that although it's not for me, if it's for you, there's nothing wrong with that. When it comes to writing's a very personal thing. There's lots of reasons to write a novel. And if we have different reasons on why we want to write a novel, there's nothing wrong with that. So just because I'm not a fan of writing the market, if you want to, that's great. When it comes to me, I am much more about following, this is the story I want to tell. This is it. This is this character arc that I really want to get this point across, or this theme, or whatever it is I'm trying to do. And writing market just doesn't connect with me.
Now, you've tried out at this point, again, nonfiction, which is clearly something that you were a teacher, so it's clearly something and you did some, we have the thriller now you're doing epic fantasy. Like, what leads you toward what you want to write? Are these the things that you read, or is it just that you're curious to see how it would feel to write one?
I definitely read epic fantasy and definitely read thrillers. I've been reading like Clive Cussler and those books since back when they first came out, the Dirk Pick novels way back in the day. I've been reading, The Hobbit and all those since I was a little kid. In terms of how I pick what I want to do next, in this case, I finished the first book of my epic fantasy series. It's 110,000 words. So it's not even like that big of an epic fantasy, but it took 6 months, and it was like a deep, dark hole, all this crazy world building, layering the languages, pulling stuff out. I was setting up this book, setting up the end of the series. It was really, really heavy, and it was a big brain burner. So I knew I wanted to take a small break before jumping back and doing the next 2 books. And that's kind of how I leaned more towards doing the 5-day novel and Amerigons.
Do you have plans, like, again, since Amerigons was a fairly, I want to say it's a short decision process to write that, do you have any plans for it going forward? Is it going to be a series, or you feel like it's a possible winner?
What I've decided is that we're at this point, it's like the second week in November. I'm going to try to get 2 more of those novels done, or at least written this year. I don't know when they're going to come out. And then starting next year, I'm going to jump back into the epic fantasy. So it's not going to be that hard to crank 2 more copies out, or 2 more books out, just because I can do it so fast. I have the structure. I know what I'm doing. And I kind of only waited this long anyway to see who's won the election, because I wanted it set more in the real world than a fake fantasy president.
Well, that's a good idea. It's also like I think it's a good decision to try to set it in the world that people will be reading it in. Are you going to try to avoid, like, is there going to be, what's the balance between timelessness and current events? Like, do you want to avoid dating it, or is it just, this is for now and don't worry too much about its long tail appeal?
I think in terms of that, if anything, this is kind of a look, even if 10 years from now, this is kind of how things were 10 years ago, So it's a slice of life of now. And it may not be as timely 10 years ago, but I think looking back, with it being set almost as like a historical, fiction, if we keep moving forward.
It'd be interesting if it turned into a really long-term series, and you basically, like, people could follow the development of real life events sort of in parallel to your story.
Well, yeah, because it's one of those things when you read, like, oh my God, someone blew up the White House in this novel, or oh, they assassinated the so-and-so, but it doesn't connect as much knowing it's, 1, not real, and 2, the sense of time between a series that lasts 20 years and it's still the same president, or the characters haven't aged. I just have never connected with that. So moving forward with this series, I was like, you know what? If I can crank them out that fast and still make them timely, why not just go for it?
It's definitely a cool idea, and I've heard like it'll be interesting too, because it'll allow you sort of to target smaller stories. Like someone had said, movies these days are all about saving the world, because once your budget goes over $100 million, the world had better be at stake. So it's like when you can work faster and smaller, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what sort of more interesting and nuanced problems can arise. One last question before I hand you off to Jeff. Since this will be a rare podcast that focuses primarily on productivity instead of marketing, although productivity is arguably the best marketing tool because it gives you the stuff that you market. I'm going to wedge a marketing question in here. What sort of marketing techniques do you find most effective for your writing?
I suck at marketing. For the launch of Amerigons, I went ahead and booked 4 promos, and then I sent it out, of course, to like my, the beta readers to get the early reviews and that kind of stuff. But that's pretty much all the marketing I've done. For the 5-day novel, I've done no marketing other than, I guess you could count this podcast as marketing. I have 2 other people who are going to push it on 2 other podcasts, and that's pretty much it. So I suck at marketing. I'm good at the writing part and the producing the work part, and I kind of deal with the marketing after the fact.
I think that is the experience for a large percentage of our listenership, hence the existence of the show. And broadly speaking, very early on, and to a degree still today, I have the same experience with marketing, which is, again, why we run the show, because I am learning from people. So it's good to know that the same experience is shared by so many. But that's all I got for this section, so I'll hand you off to Jeff for a few more.
All you got to say is that we suck just as much as everybody else does, apparently. So, but okay, you mentioned that you wrapped up your middle grade fantasy series. Since I've had a lot of people tell me that some of my own books are loved by these middle grade schoolers here, I have a question for you. When you were writing in that genre, did you have a group of kids that you gave your books to find out how they liked it? I mean, how do you determine what works and what doesn't work for that reading level?
In terms of me, I mean, I've read middle grade and I still read middle grade. I love the new, sequel to the Percy Jackson series. It's now going to the 3rd version, Rick Riordan and all his books, Brandon Mull's books. So I think I kind of already have a feel for what it is. And in terms of giving it to beta readers, they're really, really hard to find. And it's kind of weird to like, hey, I know you have a kid. Can you give your kid my book to see if they like it? It's just awkward. So it's kind of, I decide, this is the story I want to tell. This is the point I'm trying to get across. I'm going to try to make it as much relatable to them as possible and not talk down to them. Because I know growing up myself, I hated being talked down to them, by adults and in fiction. So I don't dumb it down at all.
Yeah, I learned the word you're looking for is creepy, by the way, because when people started telling me that my books were really good for kids, I'm like, is this true? So I started putting out feelers, and there's like, hey, who's got a kid that I can give a book to? I just want to see if you like it. Just gotta let me know. And that lasted for about a week. And I was like, you know what? That really makes me look bad. So we're just gonna take that right off the blog there. So yeah, I can sympathize. What are some challenges you faced when you're switching between genres or target audiences? I mean, is it just business as usual for you, or did you have to keep certain facts in mind?
So last week I launched Amerigons. This is a thriller, and keep in mind that I do have an email list. It's about 500 people, which is still way on the small side, but it's a pretty good list. They have a nice click-through rate, a nice open rate, but they're very into middle grade and just fantasy in general. So when I sent, hey, I have this new book, it's a thriller, here's the blurb, it's not for kids, but hey, check it out. I had less than 1% click-through rate on that email. So genre hopping is as they say, not smart to do. I'm kind of dealing with it as I go. What I've had to do to kind of counter that is obviously I've booked the promos, which is something I've never done before for a launch. Normally you do it after the fact, after you have a few, reviews and that kind of stuff. So I've spent the money up front for advertising. I've also reached out to a lot of authors I know saying, hey, I know you have a thrilling, I know you have a strong email list. Any chance you might want to plug this for me? We can work something out. I'll help you on the back end. I'll go ahead, and if you ever have a fantasy, I'll push that to my readers. So it's just being a little bit more creative with that kind of stuff since I don't have the already built fan base.
Okay, so here I've just thought of a question here for you, because something else I've also encountered. I've also genre hopped as well. I've actually started doing some mystery novels, and I've got a lot of people that say, "Oh, I absolutely love your fantasy novels," which again gets me to say, "Hey, if interested, I've got a couple of mystery novels now." FYI, they aren't really, they're not really PG, they're more PG-13, kind of bordering on R. And they're like, oh, my kids see that all the time on TV. They've already read it, they loved it. I'm like, I don't know if I can market that for kids. And I still don't plan on marketing it for kids, but from what everyone tells me, thanks to the modern TV and everything you can see on prime time, they're right smack in the middle of it, so nothing real new there. But okay, I have a question for you too. Is there anything you know now that you wish you would have known back when you first started writing? Anything you would have done differently?
When I first started writing the self-published stuff?
Yes.
Probably just start pushing it out faster and not worry about it as much. I finished the script 3 years ago, and I've had, the middle grade series that's come out and wrapped since then. But if I had worked harder or focused a little bit less on other stuff, I definitely could have produced more work. So if any advice I would have given to my younger self is just write more.
Yeah, everyone pretty much seems to say that. I mean, my own personal one, we say, wish I wouldn't have started so late trying to get a mailing list in order, because I ignore it. Like, yeah, I don't see the benefits of a mailing list, and then everyone's going, really? Gotta think about that and try it again. But all right, that's it for my questions. Let me hand you back over to Lindsay.
All right, cool. Well, let's jump into actually talking about the 5-day novel and maybe getting some tips for people that they might be able to use, especially this month with NaNoWriMo going on. So can you set it up for us? What all is covered in your book?
The book is kind of covered up in, there's actually 6 days. There's day 0, which speaks a lot to the mentality it takes to do something like a novel in 5 days. You know, the fact that you need to acknowledge you're a writer, you need to make sure you make time, you need to make the commitment for it. Day 1 focuses about the pre-writing. So this is outlining, doing, learning your characters, backstory, handling the full structure, the arcs, or any of that kind of stuff. Day 3 is focused on getting the first draft done. Day 4 is finishing the first draft and starting rewrites. And day 5 is just all about the polish.
All right, and we should probably clarify here. You kind of mentioned before that your thriller was started out at 38K or so.
Mm-hmm.
Are you kind of doing like the nano definition of 50,000 words as a novel? Is that sort of what you're shooting for?
And what happened here is the novel is actually 46,000 and some words and change. And then I also did a bonus story for the backup, which is another 5,000 words. So it just passed the 50,000 mark.
Okay, and so for Joe, that's a short story. And perhaps some of our epic fantasy listeners too might be thinking, okay, well, that's not a novel. Do you have any thoughts? Like, do you have to, if you want to accomplish this, should you go with like a real simple storyline or 1 or 2 POVs versus my Robert Jordan 300,000 word Chihuahua killer that I've got planned?
The more you split up the POVs with a shorter novel, the less the audience is going to connect with the characters. So obviously going with a smaller POV is the best way to go. In terms of what I did for Ameriguns, I went with 1 POV. For the sequel, I'm planning with 2. But I'm not going to write the sequel. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to do that probably in about 8 days as opposed to 5. So I'm going to have a little more less time for stressing, but it should still be about the same length. So if you're going for a shorter piece of work, definitely lower the POV count.
Okay, and I'm sure there's stuff in your book that would help people even if they are doing a longer book that they're just not going to finish in 5 days probably. I agree with you. I found with my own stuff that, I've done up to 6 POVs in a novel, and that was 200,000 words, and that obviously takes a lot longer, not only just because, I don't know, it's like not just how long it takes you to write words, like I can do 10,000 words a day when I'm cranking them out and I have a goal, but everything's much easier with 1 or 2 POVs. I've done like romances, those tend to be simpler plot lines. The later in the series, more complicated stuff where you're trying to remember everything that happened earlier in the series and get everything wrapped up. It definitely takes longer, at least for me. But some people say you can't really sell those long novels for any more necessarily on ebooks. You $3.99, $4.99 maybe, no matter what the length is, pretty much over the short novel or 50, 60K. So it's like, go ahead and write the epic if you want to, but I think there's something valid in just maybe trying to get some novels out there and going for the shorter word count. Do you have any thoughts on my rambling there?
My epic fantasy, it's 110K. And in that I have 3 main POVs and then I have 3 kind of like sub POVs. And I know when I was writing that, when I would do the head jump, I finish the chapter and I go to the next character, there was always a little bit of lag on my part as the writer, because getting in the headspace from one character to the other isn't always super simple. When you're sticking with 1 POV or 2 POV, it was definitely much easier to be like, okay, I'm in this head, I'm in that person's head, I'm back to the first person's head, and it kind of went much, much smoother. When it comes to publishing, it kind of just depends on the genre. In thrillers, it isn't unheard of to have a 50K novel. It fits there. If I were to put out a 50K epic fantasy, people would probably complain like, hey, that's not really epic fantasy. So it really just depends on the genre and kind of what's selling right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we had Annie Belay on, and I think her first novel was only 38 or 40K or so. And, I've heard too in space opera, military sci-fi, this can be shorter, but of course, like you're saying, the epic fantasy, people want a nice meaty story. You've got to create a whole world too. And it's, with your thriller, you mentioned that you're just kind of using modern times. So.
Yeah, it's a big cheat because My world building is that I don't know much about guns or FBI procedures. So, I talked to a couple of police officers, talked to Army, ex-Navy, seeing, what are the proper procedures, how are things handled, how does this work? But that was all done in like 2 or 3 days of just my own research. When I was doing the fantasy, it's like, okay, here's, weeks of time. You're like, okay, how does this rake work? How is their biology different from the humans? How does the magic system work? How is their language different now versus 1,000 years ago? And oh man, it's so much work. And like half of it doesn't even end up in the books anyway, because it's not important to the story.
Yeah, that's another thing when they're easier for me is when the less research you have to do, the more you already know, or just kind of, if you're using our world, usually there's fewer things you have to look up, or like you're saying, build and think about as far as world building goes. So it's definitely true that will shave off some time if you're not constantly hopping over to the internet or you have to figure something out. All right, so the subtitle of your novel, the 5-day novel, is The How-To Guide for Writing Faster and Optimizing Your Workflow. I've seen lots of advice on how to get more words down quickly, but what do you mean by optimizing your workflow?
The book focuses not just like, okay, I need to sit down and do a word sprint, and then I'm going to crank words out and constantly build my sprints and so forth. The book focuses much more, one, I guess, on the mindset of what it takes to be a writer, getting into the right headspace, and then basically maximizing, your workflow. How do you actually produce the book? Do you sit and kind of just work on it, a half hour a day and kind of just slowly crank on it? Do you have a set time every day that you do it? All that kind of stuff. So in terms of optimizing, one of the big things I push in the book is figure out what works best for you, because there is no real right answer. There's no one way to write a novel. It's your way might be very different from my way, but if we're both putting out quality and it's actually finished work, then who cares? And no one can tell you what that is. So in the book, I kind of have a list of what works for me. I have, what has worked for students in my past and what even works for other authors I know. And it's kind of about figuring out what you want your workflow to be and making it happen.
Do you recommend people to do anything like keeping track of like what their word count per hour is certain times of day? Because I actually, that was Rachel Aaron, I think, that was talking about how she thought she was a night person or something, but it turns out, and I'm kind of the same way. I always thought I was a afternoon, later in the day person, but it turns out if I can get those first 2,000 words done before I'm even like out of bed, that they actually come out really quickly.
In terms of what works for me, I even say this in the book, that I heard over and over again, keep track of your word count, know when you work best. It'll help you make you write faster. You'll be more focused. It bombed with me. I suck at numbers. I hate numbers. I hate spreadsheets. I hate keeping track of all that kind of stuff. So for me personally, it made me work slower. So, that's just proof right there that what works for one person doesn't work for someone else. I'm best when I'm in the story and I'm focusing, okay, for the next 3 scenes, we're working on this sequence. It's an action that we're going to slow down. I'm going to kind of tease with this little mystery. And I get much more into that kind of stuff than I do about the data.
Yeah, I'm actually not a big charting and graphing person either. So great. No, I love people who are. They're fun to talk to. They always know their numbers. But for me, the biggest thing is just kind of knowing what happens next, kind of having the scenes plotted before I sit down to write. And if I really know exactly what happens next, it's just really easy to write it. Do you recommend kind of plotting out the beats ahead of time?
If you're going to write a novel in 5 days, I would say it's virtually impossible to do it without having an outline. For me, and what I do in the book is I have a scene of, okay, here's my scene, and it's normally a location. So, okay, this scene is going to be set, on the National Mall. And then in this scene, I have a list of, okay, what's the main conflict in the scene? What's the character growth here? How does this actually serve the plot? So I know going into every scene what has to happen there before I get to it. And obviously, this is a rough outline in the sense that I don't stick to it. If kind of think of it as like a map. Like I'm going to go see Yosemite, but on the way to Yosemite, if I see the sign for the giant ball of yarn, guess what? I'm going to go see that giant ball of yarn, but I'm not going to get lost because I have my map and I can still get back on the main road to Yosemite.
All right. It's good that as fascinating as that yarn ball is, you can find your way back. I think a lot of writers get distracted by the yarn ball, and then suddenly they're going to New York, and maybe that's where things can slow down and get a little muddled.
Yeah, it's fun when you get off track, and when it serves the character and it serves the story, then it's really awesome because that's kind of what pantsers enjoy. They find those moments and they really embrace them. And if you outline too rigidly, you miss out on that. So I definitely believe in having an outline, but just making sure that outline serves your story and that you listen more to the characters than to it.
Yeah, I'll make myself do an outline before I write the book now. I've learned that I'm much better that way, mostly so I know how it ends. And then I will often, as I'm writing, I'll often look back at the outline and be like, wow, that's not really the story I wrote, but it did end the way, it always hits the ending spot. I guess the yarn is not as interesting to me. But and then I'll also do like the night before, especially when I'm trying to do like 10,000 words a day, which I don't, usually I'm trying to push myself or do a side project or something when I'm doing that, or I'm just really excited about the story. But when I'm doing that, I'll, like the night before, I'll do the next maybe 2 chapters, even in finer detail. And at that point, that's pretty much set in stone. That's what I'm going to write next. Whereas the original outline, that could deviate from that. But I find having that map laid out really helps me get to those word count goals. All right, you mentioned mindset in your blurb there, and I guess I want to know kind of like what you mean about getting in the right mindset, because I've heard a lot of people say, and I've found this to be true for myself, that whether somebody's sick or in a crummy mood that day, or if they're in a really great mood, whatever they're writing, they can't necessarily tell when they go back and edit a month later or whatever, like how their mood was that day. Like the story ends up kind of coming out the same no matter how they feel. Is that kind of what you're talking about, or are you somewhere else with mindset?
Yeah, I'm probably a little more somewhere else with mindset. Keep in mind that my strict background with teaching is college students. And a lot of college students are still at the point where they're trying to find the voice. They're trying to figure out who they are, as a creator. And they don't necessarily have the confidence that you or I or, the other guys might have. And so a lot of what I talk about in the book is, if you want to be a writer, there's a whole section saying, guess what? If you want to be a writer, you have to write. Listening to podcasts, reading books, watching movies about writing might help you become a better writer, but you're not going to be a writer unless you actually sit down and write. So it talks about, a commitment to what it takes to write. It talks about realizing that, what? The secret to writing is just putting your butt in chair and just actually doing the work. So in terms of mindset, it's kind of that the first hurdle in the sense that, you can do it. It is possible to do it. People do it. This is how people can do it. You really should try doing it. So it's more along that kind of mindset as opposed to like, I'm going to meditate or have my Zen moment before I write.
Or my chocolate or my coffee and espresso.
Right. Well, I have my chocolate. I have my espresso.
Do you have any recommendations for, and I just want to say, you mentioned podcasts, I think, or I was thinking of podcasts while you were talking, I don't know, but I find it really inspiring, has helped me get to the point where I'm writing more words every day just by listening to the fact that other people are doing it. When I first got started, I remember the self-publishing podcast guys were like, yeah, I knocked out my 6,000 words for the day today. And I'm like, 6,000 words? My goal was like maybe 2,000 a day at that point. And just kind of hearing that other people are doing it, however you can get inspired. For me, that was inspiring, knowing other people, what is it, the 4-minute mile, I don't know, whoever broke the record first, and then a whole bunch of people broke the record. It's like just knowing other people can do it can be inspiring, I think. Do you have any recommendations for how people can find that inspiration and get in that mindset?
In terms of that, it's going to be very specific to who you are as a creator. I know that I like learning. Probably one of the things I miss most about being in the classroom is that as a teacher, you learn so much from working with the students. And I definitely miss that connection. So for me, it's definitely, education. So I enjoy things like, the Writing Excuses podcast. I enjoy this show. I enjoy reading books about writing and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I'm probably get just as well inspired by seeing movies that are actually good or reading books that are really good. Saw Doctor Strange this weekend. Was it a perfect movie? No, but I enjoyed the crap out of it. And it makes me excited about, I was like, oh man, I really want to get back to fantasy. I know I'm doing the thriller things, but that magic was so cool. And there's teleportation and bendy stuff and so it's kind of just figuring out, where your passion lies and embracing it.
I'm not sure what it says about me, but I'm always more inspired by bad movies and bad books. Like before I published anything, I was like, man, if this could get published, I could totally get published. But if I read something really good, I was like, oh man, I cannot write like that. She's amazing. So there's a different mindset right there. All right, one more question for me. I think early on, I know for me, finishing was really hard in the beginning. You know, I've told people before on the show, it took me 7 years to finish my first novel that I actually published. I used to start things right about 30, 40,000 words and then just kind of like, I'm not really that crazy about the story anymore, or I'd get kind of stuck. Do you have any, you know, and now I finish everything. It's just a habit. I feel like you have to build that habit and just like make yourself finish, even if you're not excited about the story anymore. Do you have any recommendations for people that are struggling to finish things?
The biggest problem I see with finishing a lot of times is people kind of get lost in the middle. So I think you need to go back and do an outline. I think that really helps keep you on track. And what I also recommend in both books is do a pitch before you write the actual novel. So, you know who your protagonist is, know who your antagonist is, know what the main conflict is, i.e., what does the protagonist want? You know, why is the antagonist getting in their way and so forth, and know what genre you want. And then kind of just squish that all together and have a pitch. And if you have that core idea of what your story is going to be, it kind of gives you a focus. So when you do get lost, if the outline's not helping you, you can kind of look back at your pitch and say, oh yeah, that's right. This is supposed to be more of a, you know, political action thriller as opposed to, you know, just an action story or so forth. So in terms of not finishing, I would say from the very start, just have a clear plan of where you want to go. Once you're in the middle and you're completely lost, I think it's important to realize that there's no perfect writer. First drafts suck. My first drafts suck. I'm sure yours aren't perfect either. It's just how writing works. You know, writing is in many ways rewriting. And you can't get to that rewriting stage unless you finish. So as hard as that hurdle is, as hard as it is to get past that first draft, you need to get through it. You need to just suck it up, put the hours in, put your butt in the chair and type. Because if not, you're never going to finish. And clearly, whatever the story was at some point was important to you. No one else in the world can tell whatever the story is. Only you can do it. And if you don't finish, it's going to die. And that's sad.
Yeah, I've actually got one of my beta reader buddies. I don't think she'll listen to this. Maybe I'll make her listen to this one. But she's one of those ones that always starts novels too and just kind of gets lost along the way, or a new idea is more exciting. And I understand that because I used to do the same thing. I find for myself, I kind of have to have a carrot there at the end, like something I'm excited to write. For me, it's actually the epilogue because I'm such a character-loving, dialogue-driven person. Like, I got to plow through this epic climactic battle stuff where people are just dying and swords are being thrown and lasers and blah, blah, blah. But then I get to write this fun epilogue where they're whatever, fun dialogue. So I don't know if that helps anybody else, but, you know, if there's still something at the end, if it's a romance, it's almost, you know, you're excited to get the characters finally together. I don't know, in the thriller or the mystery, I guess maybe you can be excited to solve the crime or that kind of thing, but I don't know. I don't know if that helps anybody else. I guess on that note, I will pass you off to the guys to ask a few more questions.
Yep. Well, first off, I have to say that it's funny that the subject drifted to starting things and not finishing them, because inadvertently, 2016 was the year of Joe finishing the things he started. I don't think there's a single thing I wrote this year that didn't start as a giant pile of words that I abandoned. So it's, I know a thing or two about finishing. But the first question I want to ask is, we're talking about, you know, the 5-day novel. Is this more of a see if you can do it thing, or do you feel like this is a method that should be used to write novels? Like you should be writing a novel in 5 days.
I think that I did it because I wanted to see if I could do it. That was definitely one of my main driving forces. In terms of the nonfiction book that I wrote, the 5-day novel, I think it's much more about, this is how I wrote a novel in 5 days. These are the techniques I use. This is how I structured out my days. This is how I optimize my workflow. Take what you think might work for you and apply it to your own life and get your own novels out that way. So I think it's applicable to anyone, no matter how they write. I even advise in the book, I don't think many people should write a novel in 5 days. It was brutal. I broke my brain. I was completely fried. It was like running a marathon. It was brutal, absolutely brutal. If you're gutsy, you got a lot of like determination that you really want to try it, you know, you can go for it. It's possible. But I definitely don't recommend most people write a novel in 5 days.
That's what I assumed, because I mean, like Lindsay was saying, you can run a 5-minute mile, but no one's saying you should commute to work that way. You're gonna use yourself up pretty quick. And it's certainly, like, I'm glad it wasn't called like write a novel every 5 days, because that is the ultimate in the hubris, I think. I'd love to read the 3rd novel written in that way.
Oh man.
But all right, so I think it's fairly common, at least I hope it is, to find that the words simply aren't flowing on some days. Do you think it's ever acceptable to abandon writing for an entire day and go back to the drawing board or do unrelated book biz, or is like word count law?
For me personally, word count is definitely not law. I normally actually work via chapters. So normally once I start a chapter, I don't walk away until that chapter's done. In many ways, that has to do with the head jumping, because I'm in that character's point of view. I know what they're feeling at that moment. I'm kind of in their headspace. It's easier for me to write it. I know once I jump out of that, it's just much harder to get back into it. If you're just not feeling it, I mean, it just kind of depends. If you have a schedule that allows you to walk away from it and that's working with you, there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you are on a production deadline, you got to get this book out, then you kind of have to suck it up. So it just depends on the life you've built for yourself or what you're trying to do.
Now, you were saying how most of writing is rewriting, and do you think it's ever like, again, let's say the words just aren't flowing and you're just not so sure about this story. Do you think no matter what, it's a better idea just to power through to the end and then go back and fix it in the edit? Or is there ever a time when you know it's understandable to make the decision, no, this needs to go back to square one?
If you've planned well enough, there should be no reason to go back to square one. Well, if you hit a big problem when writing, and I talk about this in the 5-Day Novel, you kind of have to judge how big of a problem it is. If it's a kind of like a retcon, like, oh crap, you know what, there's this character I need to create. I need them for these later scenes, but I didn't establish them at all. Well, just make a note on your outline that when you do the rewrite, you need to reintroduce this character later on or earlier. Now, if there's a big problem and you got to take a half hour, go do like a 5-mile walk or whatever and solve it in your brain, and you sit back to come and deal with it, but you realize there's going to be heavy rewrites, what I recommend doing at that point is finding those places in the chapters, leaving bold notes for yourself. Like, okay, for this scene, the gun wasn't on the table. It was actually in the safe. So when so-and-so steals the safe later, it's not there anymore. Or, oh crap, this is how the magic system really works. Rewrite this POV because, I had it wrong the first time through. And then once you have those bold notes so that you can't forget what the specifics were, go right back to where you were and keep moving forward as if you had already made those corrections.
That's literally today. That's always been my policy. And literally today, I realized while I was taking a walk, I was like, "Oh, this character shouldn't be part of that thread. It should be part of this thread." And it's just for me, by the way, it's 3 asterisks.
Oh, nice.
Three splats, I suppose. That's easier to say, because then you can go back and search through and just sort of have a list of all of your notes with a find again. So that's my method of applying your recommendation. I want to say something else I frequently find happening, especially during NaNoWriMo. You talked about this a little bit, where you might be writing a story, and then you'll find as you write it the potential for a better story. And you were saying how it's good to be flexible and to be able to go to the ball of yarn and then come back later. Let's say that you come up with a story. Like, if in the writing of this story you come up with something that is fundamentally different, but you feel superior. What's the more important thing, getting the story done or writing the best story you can?
For me, because I'm not necessarily writing to market. For me, my priority anyway is to put out the best story. I'm going to automatically prioritize that. So whatever serves the story for me is what I'm going to aim for. I just I do a webcomic and graphic novel series called Holiday Wars, and I just finished writing the 4th book. And I had it outlined. I did my outline. I jumped in, and kind of a third of the way through, there was accidental time travel, which I hadn't planned on. It just kind of happened. And I was like, oh, crap, I'm probably have to cut that tomorrow. The next day, went to the park, got back in writing, and I didn't cut it. I kept moving forward. And when I sat down to finally do the rewrite, I just had to make sure, time loops and all that kind of stuff, that nothing broke, that I reestablished it earlier. And in the end, it's a much stronger story. And if I had listened to my outline as opposed to having, no time travel versus having time travel, well, obviously time travel is way cooler.
Yeah, and nothing screws with an outline more than time travel.
Oh man, it was a mess. And then you have to email people and be like, "Hey, this is my logic. Does that actually make sense?" And time travel is a pain.
Even when you plan from the beginning, the shape of an outline changes to accommodate time travel. Like, it's not an outline anymore; it's a flow chart.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can only imagine reworking a story to include unexpected time travel. All right, so one last question from my section before I give you to Jeff. Writing a late or mid-series title can be tricky because there's continuity issues and you know, an overarching storyline to deal with. Do you still feel like the methods that are taught by the 5-day novel can be applied to something with a lot of baggage?
I think they can work, but you're just going to have to do your due diligence before you sit down to write whatever it is you're going to write. You know, when I jump back into writing the epic fantasy series again, I'm going to have to reread book 1 before I write book 2 and 3, just because, you know, it'll already have been 6 months since I last touched it. You know, although I remember the specifics of what's happening, I might remember the little small, you know, the one-line paragraph that's really hinting at the ending of, you know, book 5 or whatever. So you just kind of have to do your homework before you sit down to write whatever it is you're going to write.
That makes a lot of sense. This is actually a thought that came to mind too. Just for something like a multi-story arc, like, you know, an epic fantasy. Obviously, you're not going to write the entire thing in 5 days. But do you feel like the same methods can be used at sort of a meta level? Like you can use all the same techniques to write the sort of the outline of the entire series and then break it down and use the techniques then on an individual book level. Like, do you feel like it can scale up and down for a series versus book?
That's what I'm doing for my epic fantasy series, is that I actually have a structure. You know, it's 9 books. This is the main arc I want for the first 3 books. This is the main arc for the next 3, and here's the arc for the final 3. And then even looking at the whole scale, so it's even right there, you know, it's almost like a first act, a second act, and a third act throughout the whole series. And then I have, okay, this is where the character starts off in book 1. This is how I want them changed and altered by the end of book 9. And how does each of these little steps push them towards that? So when I outlined the series, it started, you know, this is the big picture, and then kind of slowly whittled down till I was like, all right, I'm ready to write book 1, but just make sure that whatever I do in book 1 sets up all that stuff for later on in a way that makes sense to the story.
Yeah, that's I think it's an excellent like technique. I might have to. I up until now I've never really done an arc outline, and as we were saying this, I think that's definitely a cool idea to do. I had heard an anecdote one time from Kevin Smith, he'd never used outlines, and someone said that they were not going to accept a full script as a spec. They wanted an outline, so he ended up with an outline that had 80 pages of dialogue. And then they were like, well, you need to summarize the outline. And he didn't realize until after he had essentially just boiled it down to chapter titles that that's all they wanted from the beginning. So he learned to outline backwards. And it feels like that seems to be the direction that I'm going to have to go.
Hey, whatever works for you.
Yep. Okay, well, that's it for now. So onward to Jeff.
All right. You're obviously targeting 5-day novel to other authors, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, what type of response do you typically get when you tell your potential readers what you're trying to do? Like, hey, I'm going to teach you how to write a novel in 5 days. What's their first response?
In return to the 5-day novel, so far the response has been pretty positive. A lot of people really enjoyed finish the script, and I've had a lot of people request that I do finish the script but gear it towards novel writing. The 5-day novel isn't that. This is much more about kind of behind the scenes stuff as opposed to craft. But people seem to be happy because it's almost like a spiritual successor to finish the script. So far, people seem to be digging on it.
And the next question I have is, are you planning a sequel? Writing a novel in 4?
No. If anything, I might go ahead and do a book that's about structure. So kind of like, this is Hollywood structure for novelists, or I might do one about pitching. It just kind of depends on what I'm feeling when I'm ready to write it.
I mean, you said you used to be a film screenwriter there. That was something I'd be interested in learning how to do, because I've always heard it was really cool, and I know a couple of people in that industry that are fairly well known that I would like to be able to pitch an idea to every once in a while. But all right, what are some of the most common obstacles you've noticed or have heard of that other authors experience when it comes to being able to write quickly? Distractions, writer's block?
The biggest thing that everyone says is just, I don't have time. You know, I don't have time to write. And the only way around it is just prioritizing your life. If writing is actually important to you, if this is something you want to do, if this is something you want to finish, you kind of have to make time for it. There's no way around it. You know, maybe you're giving up watching, you know, Luke Cage and Jessica Jones at night, or, you know, maybe you're not playing board games on the weekend. Whatever it is that you have to give up to make time for this thing called writing, you have to do it or you're never going to write.
Yeah, I remember distinctly there was we had interviewed someone that said, yeah, they wrote for like, 45 minutes on the bus. Then they like wake up like an hour before like the kids get up. So they're going to dedicate that. I'm like, that takes some serious structure and dedication, because I'd be more like, I'd rather sleep.
Mhm.
But all right, so we know now that it is possible to write the novel using your accelerated pace there. Final question is there anyone you can think of that you wouldn't recommend that novel to? Or would you think that anybody can do it?
Recommend my book or recommend writing a novel in 5 days, or what do you mean?
Recommend writing at an accelerated pace and essentially try to get a book out in 5 days.
I think the majority of people shouldn't write a novel in 5 days. I say right there in the intro, you are stupid if you write a novel in 5 days. I am stupid, but although I'm stupid, I still succeeded. And if you want to be stupid like me and crazy just for the heck of it, here's exactly how I do it. But if you are a sane person, someone who, writes a novel in 15 days or 30 days, maybe check out what I did and then apply those things to your own process.
Have you had anyone come back yet and said that, hey, they followed it and they did it just like you did?
The book came out today, so...
Oh, okay. I guess not yet.
Yeah, I've had like 3 or 4 beta readers, and then that's it. So I don't know what the general feedback's going to be to it yet. I know so far people seem to enjoy the audiobook because you can, kill an audiobook in just a few hours. So I know that the audiobook's doing well. I don't know yet the response to the ebook.
All righty. Yeah, I was just curious there. All righty. That's it for my questions. Let me hand you back over to Lindsay. We'll see if we can wrap this up.
Yeah, in 4 days, that's when the emails will start flooding his box. I finished. I will say that I think that maybe we're all crazy, those of us who try to do this really quickly, but I've definitely found that some of the most fun I've had writing novels is doing them quickly, or anytime I give myself a deadline like that, I don't know, if you're the kind of person that deadlines work for, you kind of get it done. Whereas if you're like, well, I just got to finish this whenever, it becomes whenever. It's 2 months later and you're still only 10K into it. So even though maybe 5 days is tough for most people, maybe a month or something, if not 5 days. But having that deadline and like telling yourself, like with me, I have to book my editor. She's gotten really popular, so I have to book her well ahead of time. So just knowing I have, okay, this has got to be there on November 10th. And it can be stressful, but it can be inspiring as well and really help get you to stay on track. So I would encourage people to look into the idea, even if they're daunted by it.
I like the idea that you brought up fun, because that's probably something I should have mentioned in my book, but I didn't. I had a lot of fun writing the 5-day novel, Ameriguns, in 5 days. And then I had a lot of fun writing the novel about writing that in 5 days. And that was probably one of my main driving forces. I mean, you talked about having a carrot at the end. In many ways, for me, writing about the process was my carrot. So it definitely pushed me through the process and was very enjoyable. I know for the sequel, my wife's going out of town for a business trip for 8 days next week. And guess what? She's gone. I'm like, ooh, that's the perfect time for me to go ahead and write the sequel. If I can do it in 5 days, 8 days should be totally easy. So I'm definitely excited, and fun is important to me. And if fun's important to you, then do whatever you can to make your writing fun. If not, why are you writing?
Yes, fun is a good thing. And I do feel like when you kind of get in the zone when you've got it all plotted out, you know what's going down. You're like, okay, let me try to get this much done today. And you're like, start seeing it rolling like a movie in your head, and it's just easier to write than, I feel like if you only do like 1,000 words a day, you're spending half of your writing time kind of remembering where you were in the story. Mm-hmm. When you're doing more in a day, you can actually get through a couple chapters and really feel like you made progress in the story. So for anybody even if you don't write full time, I think you could do like Scott did. And like, I happen to have this 1 week off or this block of time, my wife's out of town, where I can really focus on it, and you'd be surprised with how much you can get done, for sure. All right, let me wrap up here with just a couple questions from Twitter. AKR Scott asks, how long does it take to refill your creative tank after knocking out a novel in 5 days?
I wrote the 5-day novel starting on a Monday, finished on a Friday. We went to the beach on Saturday. On Sunday, we played board games. And then on Monday, I was sitting down writing the novel about writing the novel. So I was back to work on Monday.
But you haven't continued to write one every week since then. Do you feel like that would be difficult? I mean, I have heard of people that put out a couple novels a month, but what are your thoughts there?
I could probably, if I was going to try to do this in a frequent schedule, it would probably be about 15 days would be a non-stressful schedule for me. But that's business days, not like counting weekends. I think that would work in my case. After I finished the 5-day novel, Lisa's family was here for 2 weeks. And then I had a death in the family. I was back in Maryland for 2 weeks. Then I got back here and I went ahead and did my graphic novel, did a Kickstarter, and now I'm preparing to do, the next one. So it's been nonstop, project except for the weird interruptions from family stuff. But keep in mind too, I do the photography and those kind of things. So my creative process is already kind of split. It's easier for me not to get burned out because I'm already doing multiple things anyway.
Yeah, and if you were going to try to keep it up, I think it might be useful to kind of do what you did, maybe do a nonfiction in between or something different to cleanse the palate, maybe, I don't know. All right, question from Dale. He was asking what your prep and revision process are like and how long everything takes.
In the 5-day novel, my first day is all pre-writing. And the reason I did it that way, because I probably could have started writing on day one, but it was really important to me to see if I could do 50,000 words in one day. I know, it was very stupid. I admit that it was stupid. I know I was stupid, but it was okay because I knew it was stupid and was still trying. So I definitely finished all my pre-writing within day one. And generally speaking, that's probably about how long it takes, unless I'm doing some like really wonky, weird outlining, or like right now I'm waiting to see who wins the election. Otherwise, pre-writing doesn't take that long. In terms of revision and rewriting, it depends how my drafts are. I'm definitely an underwriter. So that means that when I sit down to do the rewrites, I have to flesh out the POVs more. I have to write the descriptions. There's many cases where I'm writing, I'm like, okay, dragon eats dude. And that's my whole sentence. And then when I come back to rewrites, it's like, well, crap, now that whole sentence needs to be expanded to like 3 paragraphs or whatever serves the story. So it just depends on your own writing style. Rewrites for me generally take about as long as the actual writing. If not, maybe a little bit shorter. But pre-writing is just done like that.
And at the end of the 5 days, had you already done your editing?
Yeah, that's built into the process. So I did, the pre-writing, the first draft, the rewrites, and then the polish.
Okay, and do you ever send stuff off to beta readers, and then because that's probably what slows me down. First goes to beta readers, and then I incorporate their feedback, and then I send it to my editor, and I have to go through her line notes afterwards, and not like I'm not getting enough novels out, but if I was just writing them and kind of self-editing them and putting out there, which I've actually heard people doing with pen names and some of the obscure romance genres, maybe I wouldn't put my own name without having gone through an editor, but that's definitely, that'll slow you down a little bit.
I'm a big fan of actually alpha readers. So I know people who've been reading my stuff for like, 10, 15 years now. And then I'm also fine hiring editors to do just alpha reads. So I'm a big fan of having someone alpha read, doing whatever rewrites, and then sending it off to my editor. I didn't do that in this case because I felt that would have been cheating, breaking the rules of what I set up in the 5-day novel. But for like the epic fantasy, I went ahead and finished the draft in June. I sent it to the alpha readers. I got it back in July. I made rewrites based on their notes, and then I sent it to my editor.
Yeah, and it could depend on the complexity of the story too, and how confident you are in your own writing. I've done stuff without beta readers before when it's a real simple story, and I don't think I necessarily need to change much. But when it's book 8 in a series, I kind of need somebody who has a better memory than I do, and some of them do. Most everybody does. Somebody's like, remember in book 3 when you said this one thing and you're contradicting it now? But yeah, it's great if you can just find a process that works for you. I mean, that's kind of what I do, is just do it over and over again each month instead of just during NaNoWriMo. And that's, you have the luxury of that when you're doing it full time, of course. But all right, so that was the last of our Twitter questions. So why don't we just finish up? Tell us what you're working on next. You kind of already have, and if there's anything you'd want us to check out.
I'm working on the 2 sequels to the thriller, and then coming next year, I'm going to jump back into my fantasy series. So keep an eye out for those. If you're looking for something, definitely check out the 5-day novel. I think it should be interesting. And if you buy it probably this week, it should still be on sale before the price gets jumped up to $2.99.
All right, cool. And is that one available everywhere, or is that a Amazon Kindle Unlimited kind of thing?
It's an Amazon Kindle Unlimited thing.
Oh, only Amazon fans get to write a novel in 5 days.
It's kind of how things are right now in the market. If you don't have a list built up, you're kind of stuck in their system.
No, I know perfectly well the temptation of the page reads counting as income and the sales rank. But that's for the marketing podcast, so I guess we'll get back to that stuff next week. But in the meantime, where can we find you online?
I am at Scott King on Twitter, or you can follow me on my website, www.scottking.info.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and I hope the new thriller and the book the 5-day book go well for you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for all the info, Scott. It's nice meeting you, sir.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.